Alright everyone, it's time to talk about the term Islamophobia, namely the fact that it does not exist. It's a Newspeak delusion that's used to protect an organized religion and some of its more violent adherents from any form of censure from the population, under the understanding that people who question Islam are bigoted in some way. Now, ask yourself this: have you ever heard of the term Hindu phobia? What about atheophobia or Christphobia or something like that? You've probably never heard of these concepts. That's because nobody has seen fit to actually develop a term for a condition which does not exist. There's no such thing as Christphobia. There's no atheophobia. There's no Hindu phobia. There's questioning of organized religion. There's certainly refutation of religious doctrine. But there's no phobia associated with it. The same is true for Islam. Islamophobia does not exist. People who oppose Islam fall into various groups. Some fall into all of them. People who dislike Islamic dogma, that is, they've read the Quran, maybe the Hadiths, they find what they see there to be objectionable. People who refute the actions of one or more classes of Islamists, that would be most people would find, including a lot of more secular side Muslims, would find the sort of actions of ISIS or Al-Qaeda inappropriate. They would find it immoral. Then you've got moderate Islam, again so-called because what is classed as moderate Islam often does include material that would be considered extremely evangelical and bigoted if a Christian were saying it. Like, oh, no, I don't think gay rights should be a thing. Women's rights, yeah, okay, maybe they're not property, but they're less than men. If a Christian group were espousing doctrines similar to moderate Islam, we would label them a far-out-there Christian group. We would put them on the fringe of the evangelicals. They certainly wouldn't be mainline Protestants. They wouldn't be Catholics after most sorts. They wouldn't be Unitarians or Mennonites or something like that. They'd be much further out. Methodists, rather, not Mennonites. It's totally different. There is no Islamophobia, though. Nobody's saying, well, I hate all Muslims because Muslim. They're looking at the dogma. They're saying the dogma's objectionable, so I can't support Islam on that basis. Or they're looking at the actions of some Muslims and saying those are objectionable. Now, the trust funders in the West, who keep trying to debate me on something that I've actually studied in an academic setting, namely Islamic dogma, they often say, well, that's an improper interpretation, all the sword verse is overruled and stuff like that. That's not the way in which most Muslims in the world, though, interpret that dogma. Most Islamists who exist today are more or less literalists. When they get to the fringe of literalism, you get movements like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or something like that. But that doesn't mean that when I question Islam as an organized religion, when I look at some cleric who's spouting violent rhetoric or bigoted rhetoric or something like that, it's not because I'm afraid of Islam. It's not because I'm phobic towards them that I refute that. I refute it for the same reason I refute evangelical Christianity, because I find it to be objectionable. The things that are said I find to be immoral, anti-spiritual, and they're part of a politicized religious movement that really exists to create misery in the human world. Now, if you apply that to Christianity, if I sit here and make a video about why I disagree with evangelicals and point to, some acts of violence, abortion clinic bombing or something, these same people say, oh yeah, well, yeah, actually, absolutely, yeah, Christianity, it's a big problem. If you do that for Islam, though, they'll call you an Islamophobe, which doesn't even exist. They're simply saying they don't have a way to refute what you're saying. The examples you're using within the dogma are, subjectively speaking, perfectly appropriate to refute because it depends on how a person interprets that dogma. Most Muslims take the sword verse at face value. They don't interpret it in this sort of willy-nilly manner that the average Westerner is going to interpret it as. It would be like Christianity. There are Christian groups in Africa today that still literally burn witches. Their idea of a witch is someone with cerebral palsy or autism or something like that. They get burned alive. They get the tire treatment. They get necklaced. Or they get left in a ditch to die when they're someone who's sick or something. Oh, they've been bewitched. They'll leave them to die, according to our understanding of the biblical doctrine. A Westerner doesn't understand that because their culture doesn't allow them to interpret it in that manner. But they're not from the West. Therefore, they interpret it much more literally. They're looking at the Old Testament, finding acts of violence there and emulating them because of their literal interpretation tendencies. And they do that because oftentimes in the less developed world you have a lack of strong state authority in rural areas. It's not like here where it's small town America. You're still going to find basically, in general, the same type of law and order, the same appreciation for secular judgment that you're going to find in an urban setting. That's not the way it works in most parts of the world. I think Westerners would be very surprised, I think, to see how life actually operates in some of these areas. There are a few places in the US you can go where you'll still find this going on, or in Europe. It's rather rare, though. Things are more developed. They're more dense, generally speaking, where people exist at all. That's just sort of the way it goes. You go into the outlands of far eastern Turkey, or maybe southern Iran, or parts of rural Pakistan, you're going to find a totally different way of life. It's not just Islam, by the way, that this happens in. There's going to be a big difference in how some urban-dwelling Hindu practices their religion generally. Not always, but generally speaking. Someone from Bombay or Hyderabad or something like that, and somebody who's living in some swamp somewhere in the outlands in a village of 100 people. There's going to be a difference between those two things, that the tendency towards literalism is going to be more pronounced in areas that lack the trappings of development. It's just the way that it is. The fact is that much of the Islamic world is like the latter. Most of the Islamic world is not fully developed. Therefore, you get a lot of literalism. Now, over time, some of this may solve itself, but it never will if the Western world doesn't wise up and begin criticizing the worse aspects of the dogma. I attack it from the same perspective that I attack any organized religion. This includes, by the way, people who are fundamentally irreligious, but have turned atheism essentially into a religion. By the way, the skeptics and all those out there. The Christians are fundamentally right when they say that. They're not saying, you've got to differentiate between religiosity, theism, and spirituality. You as a skeptic, you're probably not any of these things. You're atheistic. That's not a religion. It has nothing to do with religion. It's just whether or not you believe in a deity. You're probably not spiritual, but again, it doesn't have anything to do with religion. That you're talking more about spirits and superstition and mythological lore and things like that. Religion is an organized, politicized style of movement that stems from spirituality and theism. Where they overlap, you tend to get an organized religion. Somebody believes in a deity, or they don't believe in a deity. Once it becomes fundamentally organized, you have a religious body, with or without spiritual trappings. In fact, there is a spiritual trapping of a sort. Psychologically speaking, science is a stand-in for spirituality. The two are twain. The two do have interplay between them. Now, you can argue, well, yes, but our sort of pseudo-religious movement of hardline atheism is, correct because no proving a negative, stuff like that. Okay, that's fine. But it operates in the same manner. It can become politicized, and it brings the same sort of problems that an actual organized religion can bring to the world. Namely, problems with people's psychology, violence, although far less often than certainly within the realm of Islam or Christianity. My point would be this. Islamophobia is a Newspeak term that was specifically developed by people who want to push off Islam on the Western world in order to shield it from criticism by labeling anybody who criticizes the dogma or the actions of the adherents as bigots. See, it gives them a lot of wiggle room to maneuver around any argument you make, because they can say, not all Muslims. So when an attack occurs, they say, don't be Islamophobic, that's not real Islam. Do any of these people attempt to say that you're Christophobic if you point to a problem that has arisen within some Christian body? They burned somebody as a witch. They bombed an abortion clinic, something. And they say, well, that's not true Christianity, stop being Christophobic. Here's the thing, though. When they make these arguments together, what does it actually mean? You've got to think a little bit. They're saying it's not Islam, yet they're calling you an Islamophobe. It doesn't make sense. It's a paradox. The two things are exclusive to one another. Either the person conducting the violence is a Muslim and they can label you an Islamophobe, or they're not actually a Muslim. There's no such thing as Islamophobia, because apparently anytime someone who proclaims themselves to be a member of that religious body, they're not actually a member of it if they're doing anything wrong. I see no similar excuse making made for any other religious group on the face of the earth today, only for Islam. The fact is, what they should be using is more sectarian terminology. There's a big difference between Shia and Sunni Islam. There are different groups within those too. There's the Wahhabi sect of Sunni Islam, sort of the Saudi path, and some of the sort of tribal, very cultural, religious sectarian movements in Central and South Asia are the ones that tend to spawn violence. You look at other groups within Islam, there are those that are almost pacifistic. They would be, honestly, more along the lines of a Unitarian Christian or something, doesn't even care. You look at the Alawite path. The Alawite are technically Muslims. They're Syrian, generally speaking. They are toying with paganism. They have no problem with state secularity, and they take a very soft approach to the Islamic doctrine. They're not literalists. And so nobody really, the people who have a problem with the Alawite tend to be religious zealots that keep trying to wipe them out because they don't see them as Muslim enough. And therein lies the other problem. When the left especially is unwilling to criticize the doctrines of Islam, to criticize what is found morally objectionable from the average Western standpoint within the dogma, it doesn't put any pressure on Islam to actually reform itself, to come about to modernity in the sense of morality. It means that there's an absence of pressure on those so-called moderate Muslims that, if they're so moderate, why would they care if you're criticizing the dogma? Would be my question. It's like if a person is a liberal or a moderate Christian, they're like a mainline Protestant, they might get a little hot under the collar, but they're not going to haul off and shoot at you because you say, no, I don't believe in Jesus Christ. You might get, physically attacked by someone who's severe fire and brimstone mode, someone's a tongue-speaking Pentecostal, everyone is going to hell Southern Baptist. But you're not going to face that from a Unitarian. You're not generally going to get profiled by a group of liberal Catholics or something like that. There's a big difference in these different interpretations of the same doctrine. They're using the same Bible and they come to different conclusions. Why is it so difficult for the left to understand that the same thing happens within Islam and that their gated community interpretation that's all fluffy and happy with puffy white clouds and unicorns and stuff isn't the way that the average Muslim interprets the doctrine? It's a minority standpoint within the organized religious body. And that there are multiple subsets of this religion that are, for sectarian and cultural reasons, constantly fight one another. It would be a bit like Catholics and Protestants hundreds of years ago when they used to do the same thing. There's a similarity. They used to beat on each other or go to war over some minor difference in biblical dogma. The same happens now within Islam. It happens within Judaism too. There's a big difference between an Orthodox Jew, very, very religious, actively practicing in every way, very literal, and someone who's a liberal Jew. They're like, yeah, I ate a bagel today. I had some lox and bagels, and that's about it. Yeah, okay, there's a Yahweh. Who cares? And then they go and, they enjoy the same sort of life that anybody else does because they don't take it too seriously. They're not literalists. Literalism is a cancer in this world. When it's overlapped, if someone wants to be a literalist but they're not a member per se of a religion, they just sort of go out in the woods and be spiritual, no, they're not harming anybody. Who cares? When it gets overlapped with an organized, politicized religious body, as we see in some Christian and many Muslim movements, it becomes problematic. And there are people who don't understand that. They would rather throw around the term Islamophobe to describe anybody who points this out. Like there's something wrong with them. And I can remember not even a decade ago when these people didn't have this problem. They realized, organized religion, yes, it's problematic. Literalism within religion is even worse than just an organized body itself. They used to understand this. Now, of course, if you point this out, there's something, I guess, morally wrong with you. If you don't want to have a bunch of zealots around you who are going to enforce religious law, or at least try to, then you're an Islamophobe. Well, I disagree. That's about all. Peace out.